And I have this selfish want, want to ask you about something that you wrote about in your book.
Yeah.
That really, this is not where it fits into the conversation in any way other than with like the full admission of it being like a selfish interjection because I want to have it put out in the world on my podcast.
That's what I want too for you. I get a lot out of the actual interplay of each person's unique, and they're pulling from their wants. That's it's more alive that way for me. So there's joy in hearing that.
Okay, so here's what it is. Can you talk a little bit about, you make a presentation in your, I thought I muted my mic. You make a presentation in the book when you're speaking about the role mushrooms have played in the sort of evolution of the human from a neurobiological standpoint, as well as a consciousness, mental capacity standpoint, as well as a social standpoint. At one point, you speak to the genes that are responsible in the modern human for what we diagnose as ADHD and neurodivergence, and there being an intersection between like the genetic basis of ADHD, neurodivergence, as well as psilocybin and its role in human evolution. So I wonder if you could lay that on for us.
Yeah, part of it came from research and part of it from studying myself. I was diagnosed at 15 with ADD. And by 18, I wrote it off and I was like, this is something humans just made up. It's just classifying each other. The medications aren't helping, all this stuff. And then about 5 years ago, I was on 5 hits of LSD. And halfway through the journey, for some reason, sort of out of nowhere, thinking my mind about the ADD. And I'm like, I'm curious if this is real. So while I'm on the 5 hits, I take out the iPad, I start doing some research. And I'm like, yep, I hit every fucking criteria of like what's ADD. Kept going down to the research, and I see that they've isolated the genes of ADD. So it's not just a human cultural construct, it's a part of the physiology, and it leads to a different brain formation and a personality type, right? So it could be there's more sensitivities and more creativity, sometimes impulsivity, there's a drive for novelty. There's a lot of things I'm like, wow, yep, hit all these markers. But to see it as a structural physiological element, was huge and helped me have more acceptance for myself, both my strengths and sometimes the shortcomings, So for example, I've went through doctor programs. I write a lot, but I'll read my paper 12 times and miss typos. I just can't.
Oh yeah,
can't,
I feel you.
For the life of me, and I'll go carefully. I spend 100 hours and I'm still missing typos. So that's where something like help is good. I'll hire an editor who's very skilled at that. They read it one time, they get all the typos. So there's a symbiotic relationship that can form, and I get to focus on my strengths. And as part of the research, I saw scientists have found that the genes go back at least 10,000 years, but of course, probably much, much more. And there was a lot of advantages for these genes of why they were passed forward. They would share, for example, because sometimes the ADHD, the hyperactivity, or the urge to do things, they might have been the first people in the tribe to pick up a spear if there was a predator coming by. So there's a lot of braveness and courage. It's like even with your book, there's a breaking through of putting things out there. But there's also, I would say, at the root of ADHD, if we look at the neurophysiology, there's a lack of dopamine being made. So the brain's trying to bootstrap itself up, looking at a whole bunch of different things to stimulate itself to create dopamine. You can get dopamine for novelty and learning. So they also would have been one of the more restless types that moves migration forward. So there's some scientific papers that ADHD might have helped pull the sphere of migration throughout the planet, right? Also look for new sources of food. Like I see in myself, like I have a drive, a need for novelty and for newness, right? So that also can lead to growth. If not done well, it also leads to not good experiences, right? So there's also a tendency for addiction and so on.
Sure, hyperfixation.
Yeah. So those that don't know, you can also hyper focus with ADD, ADHD if you're really interested in something, right? So it's sometimes the name doesn't really describe it well, but psychedelics are like novelty generators. It's like forever learning and growing and different in its time. So the people with ADD, ADHD would have been likely the first to explore new sources of food, come across, find psychedelics. If we didn't I mean, the idea is primates, some of them even eat fungi, right? So it would have been early on, but we would have been constantly looking for new sources, find these elements, have these novel experiences, been in trance, would have kept going back to them, brought them to the tribe, and it would have played a lot of the personality structure, a lot of pivotal roles in the finding of it, the inclusion, the keep using of it. And so, yeah, I think historically it really helps add a lot to the picture.
Mm-hmm. Also, selfishly, as somebody with ADHD and has spent quite a bit of time internally as well as externally having the sort of shame and guilt complex of like not focusing and so on and so forth, and failing to sort of meet these basic human expectations that are actually socio-cultural expectations. I don't know if you can hear my stomach rumbling. To hear you make the proposition that it's possible that the very evolution of human consciousness that became our capacity to self-reflect and be in all this, like have the human consciousness that we understand consciousness to be now was a consequence of people with ADHD leading the charge in being the first ones to pick up psychedelic mushrooms and be like, hey guys, this is great. Let's keep doing this. It was kind of a selfish appeasement of like, yeah, you're welcome. It also explains a lot as to why I was so excited and being like, what are these mushroom things? Even at a young age, like, I want to find these. I want to try these. Well, that was interesting. I want to do that again. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, it's correlated with creativity, ingenuity. So a lot of people that create things in the tribes with tool making, art, and so on, likely had that kind of, personality structure. So there's an openness to experience a lot of times when people have this personality structure. So it would have done well. And yeah, I mean, for me, the owning of it in my 30s helped release some of the shame too of like, why is some things just a little bit more difficult for me, and it's just, and I think maybe we'd come up with a better name at some point. I know the gene they've isolated. Sometimes they call it the wanderlust gene. Again, the drive for new experiences, more likely to travel and do things. It's just we're also just more fascinated sometimes with things. But so it's only in the modern day context where people have to sit in desks at school for like 8 hours and sit still and focus on whatever somebody's telling you, and kind of like people with ADHD aren't the best at following the rules or staying in a structure, So it's only in this modern day kind of way that it's been a problem. But in a tribal setting, there's a lot of characteristics that would have been celebrated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was what just came to mind. Oh yeah, like shifting the name of the diagnosis from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder to like novelty wonder, the novelty wonder complex, excessive novelty wonder complex or something, and be like, I'm sorry, ma'am, it appears as though your child might be wonderful.
Right. And I think that's the drive. It's for novelty underneath. And for me, where this is, I really love is got really into Terence McKenna, and the two pools of the universe is habit and novelty. And novelty is just barely winning. That's why we have, evolution taking place. There's newness. And so there's a drive to be at the front of the evolutionary process. For me, there's a hunger for novelty, but it leads to expansion and growth. There could be a restlessness sometimes, or what looks I feel really responsible, but irresponsible to others because it's not the way they're normally living. And so like to a prior, even 10 years ago, taking psychedelics might have seemed irresponsible to some people. Now it's like, hey, this is leading edge, right? So there's a way of moving towards the forefront and being experimental. And, it's part of that personality structure.